to present our distinguished lecture for tonight, and looking forward to it.
Thanks, Linda. I'm going to apologize. So good evening. I'd like to introduce our distinguished lecturer for this evening, Dr. Sumudu Atapattu, and I apologize if I did not say that correctly, but I am happy that she's here for us. Her presentation is on climate change and human rights, a justice conundrum. Dr. Atapattu is a professor and director of the Global Legal Studies Center at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She is also the executive director of the campus-wide interdisciplinary human rights program. And she has, I think I skipped some, she has been involved with a number of works related to human rights. And so I think that we're going to have a very fruitful discussion with Dr. Atapattu. And so welcome, Dr. Atapattu, for this evening. We look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much, Mary, and thank you to the UN Association for inviting me here today. So I was told I should speak for about 50 minutes because I want to put the timer. All right. And let me share my screen. Can you guys see this?
Yes.
Great.
Yes.
All right. So December 10th was the Human Rights Day. So I thought we'll take a couple of minutes to discuss why it is considered as a Human Rights Day. It was the day when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted by the UN General Assembly in 1948. I'm pretty sure all of you are familiar with this remarkable document. I want to say the very first section, the provision in the Universal Declaration says all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. I think it's very important for us to remember this and try and apply this in our work and practice and day-to-day lives. Because I think we have a long way to go to actually achieve this. It was adopted 74 years ago. Next year will be the 75th anniversary, and the Human Rights Program is planning a big event for that, and I'm sure the UN might have something as well. So this is the document. The First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, was instrumental in getting this adopted. I think it's as valid today as it was 74 years ago. So what I'm going to talk about today is the link between human rights and climate change. Climate change, as you know, is causing a lot of destruction, and a lot of peoples are affected from all over the world. This is a summary of my presentation today. So we have seen severe weather events. In fact, the US is experiencing one right now. So climate change is causing massive disruption around the world. So this is a global problem, which means that everybody, every state, each of us is contributing to the problem. And nobody will be spared the consequences, but not everybody contributed equally, and not everybody will experience these adverse consequences equally either. So the unfortunate thing is that historically marginalized communities, poor people, and poor countries will experience these consequences disproportionately, although their contribution to climate change is relatively small, and that's why this raises justice questions. So I will talk more about this later. And because the window is getting narrower and narrower for us to take action to address climate change, Indigenous leaders called upon President Biden to declare a climate emergency last year. So I look at the consequences of climate change, especially on communities and countries that are disproportionately affected, and I discuss the role of environmental justice and human rights, because the enjoyment of rights is seriously jeopardized by climate impacts. So this is the outline of my presentation. I will talk a little bit about what we know so far about climate change. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report in 2021, it came out with its 6th assessment report. This is the body of UN, it's a UN appointed body of scientists from around the world that synthesize science relating to climate change. So I will also talk about the consequences of climate change on marginalized communities, and the communities that are disproportionately affected, especially small island states and climate refugees. I will talk about the role of environmental justice and climate human rights. Last year, the Human Rights Council adopted a resolution recognizing a human right to a healthy environment as a standalone right. I mentioned that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted in 1948. As you can imagine, there's no provision on the environment in the Universal Declaration, and the international community took almost 74 years to recognize this right. And this was followed by a resolution of the UN General Assembly in almost identical language, recognizing a right to a healthy environment as a separate right. If we have time, I'll talk a little bit about the climate conference, referred to as COP27, that was concluded last month in Egypt. And I will conclude with some thoughts. So this is the cover of the Time magazine a few months ago. I think it was actually last year. This is the UN Secretary General, and it's titled Our Sinking Planet. So what do we know about climate change? We know that the Earth is warming, and the temperature has already warmed by 2 degrees Fahrenheit. Since the Industrial Revolution. So just think about that. All these consequences we are experiencing are due to a 2-degree increase in temperature. And this is a permanent increase in temperature, not the day-to-day fluctuations we see. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has said that the evidence is clear, and humans are largely responsible for this change. Over 95% certainty, the IPCC has established that this is a human-made problem. And the last 4 years, actually this has changed. The last 4 years, last 5 years have been the hottest years on record. And you may recall that for the first time, Western Canada saw temperatures go above 50 degrees Celsius, and that's like 122 degrees Fahrenheit. Imagine Canada getting temperatures like this. So climate change affects everybody, but as I said, it will affect some communities and states more than others. And it's already affecting millions of people worldwide, and millions will be forced to move as a result of climate change. In fact, many communities are already being relocated, even in the United States. I have a few slides on that. So just to show what is climate change, this is the greenhouse gas effect. Because of the greenhouse gases that are emitted by countries all over the world in relation to energy generation, transportation, industries, etc. Because there's so much greenhouse gases that we have emitted since the Industrial Revolution, the Earth is, these gases are trapped in the atmosphere, which is acting like a greenhouse, basically. So that's why the Earth is warming, because these the gases that we have emitted over the years. So this shows where these emissions are coming from. As I mentioned, electricity and heat production is responsible for 25% of the emissions, and this is worldwide. Agriculture and forestry and other land use changes is similar, about 24%, buildings 6%, transportation 14%, and industry 21%. So as you can see, almost everything we do contributes to climate change, which makes this a very complex situation to address, because you cannot put a solution in one area like energy and then forget about the rest. You have to tackle all of them at once. And this chart shows the different gases that are involved. So carbon dioxide has received a lot of attention, but methane and nitrous oxide are also responsible. So this shows carbon dioxide emissions by country. As you can see, China is responsible for 28% of all the global emissions, followed by the United States at 15%. And then we have India, 7%, Japan, 3%, Russia, 5%, etc. So you can see that US and China account for almost half of all the emissions. And this graph shows how the global temperatures have increased since the Industrial Revolution. And this is only up to 2000, and the current temperatures are off the chart. So this is what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change said last year. Because of the time lags that are involved, we cannot avoid some of the devastating impacts. Those impacts will take place because of all the emissions that are already there in the atmosphere. There's still a narrow window to keep the situation from worsening, but we have locked in about 30 years of really worsening climate impacts, no matter what we do. We have emitted so much greenhouse gases that warming will continue until the middle of the century, even if we drastically reduce our emissions. So no matter what we do, the next 30 years we'll see worsening impacts. And the report continued that other impacts will continue for longer. It doesn't mean that the worst impacts will cease, but things like sea level rise will continue to rise for at least 2000 years. Just think about that. And the other thing that the report pointed out was that the impacts are happening faster than they expected. So this means that we have to learn to live with these consequences and try and minimize the impact on people and other species. It's not just the people who are affected. There are animals and many other species that are affected by the warming temperatures and other consequences. And we have to build our infrastructure to withstand these consequences as well. But some communities will have to be relocated, and this is happening already. The other unfortunate thing is that states have made commitments to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, but there's a big gap between what is promised and what is needed. So the United Nations Environment Program produces this annual report called the Emissions Gap Report. And this is what the 2022 report said. This has been like a recurrent theme in these reports, that there's a huge gap between what is promised and what is needed. And even with the updated pledges at the last COP event, that was the 26th one, the states were able to make only a negligible difference in the emissions. And we are far from achieving the Paris goal of 1.5 degrees. In other words, limiting the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius is considered as a safe level. And remember, we have already warmed by 1.1 degrees Celsius. So we don't have much bigger room here. And report said if the current policies continue, we will have a temperature increase of 2.8 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. So the current pledges will only take us to 2.4 to 2.6 degrees Celsius. And it's, as you can see, it's nowhere near the 1.5 degree pledge that states made at the Paris conference in 2015. So what we need to do is to reduce our emissions 45% if we are to achieve 1.5 degrees. And a 30% increase will take us to a 2-degree increase by 2030. And that is not very far away, as you can see. And this was the last year's report, again said the same thing. So let's take a look at the impacts on people. We will have water scarcity. And as you know, California and the western parts of our country are already experiencing a huge drought. There's land degradation and desertification, and this is affecting a lot of countries in Africa. So when land becomes like a desert, you cannot really grow anything there, which will affect food production and food security. And there are health impacts because when the temperatures get warmer, there will be tropical diseases that are not experienced in the temperate countries, like malaria and dengue. So we have to be prepared for the health impacts as well as the mental health impacts, because that is an understudied area. A lot of people have this climate phobia now. In fact, many the younger generation is very worried about the impacts, and many don't want to get married and have children because they fear that the world will not be a good place for children to live. And then there will be severe weather events, and we have seen many of these already. But because of climate change, these severe weather events will increase in frequency and intensity. So flooding, droughts, hurricanes, etc., at a rate that we have not seen before. And we will also see sea level rise. Again, these consequences are actually happening already. We have seen increased wildfires and mass displacement of people and conflict, because when there's less resources like water and food, this could lead to conflict as well. And we are already seeing the adverse impacts on people. So this is what I think it was a group of 100 doctors said last year. They called upon their countries to address climate change seriously and said it is said to become the defining narrative of human health, and said that the COVID-19 pandemic would pale in comparison to the impacts of climate change on people. So this is Canada. I mentioned they experienced 50-degree temperatures last year. And this is the year before the bushfires in Australia, which killed millions of animals, actually, and so many people. These were the fires that were raging in Australia that year. Severe weather events, the flooding, we see more and more instances like this. And this is Hurricane Sandy in 2012. Hurricane Maria in 2017, and Hurricane Ian a few weeks ago, actually, in Florida. And, you know, I can put many more pictures like this from all over the world. And this is floods in Pakistan. About 1/3 of the country was underwater for many, many weeks. Affecting, I think the damage was like $2 or $3 billion. So if you look at the impacts on the US itself, again, the US Environmental Protection Agency has a report called Climate Change Impacts Health, Environment, and Economy. There's a huge economic problem as well, although a lot of people don't seem to realize that climate change has economic implications. Warmer temperatures will increase frequency, intensity, and duration of heat waves, posing health risks, especially for children and the elderly, worsening air and water quality, again, spreading diseases, rising sea levels, that's threatening coastal communities. Flooding in Florida is a common situation now, although they don't like to talk about climate change there. Changes in rainfall, weather patterns is also a problem, and it also affects the production of hydroelectricity, and relocation of communities is already happening in this country. In Alaska, Louisiana, and many of these communities are indigenous, and as you know, they have a very intimate relationship with their land. So when they are to be relocated, they lose part of their culture, and this has been a big problem for these communities. In the US, this is the greenhouse gas emissions. This shows the greenhouse gas emissions by economic sector in the US. So this is 2020, and there's hardly any difference between 2020 and 2018. Transportation, 27%, electric generation is 25%, industry 24%, commercial and residential buildings, 13%, and agriculture, 11%. So very similar percentages in 2018. And per capita, again, electricity and heat generation takes the biggest chunk, followed by transportation and buildings. And in terms of the US states that are responsible, you can see that Texas is the biggest contributor, followed by California and Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin is somewhere here. And if you look at climate change in Wisconsin, as I said, nobody will be spared the consequences. So the governor established a task force on climate change a few years ago, which highlighted that the changing climate is impacting everybody. It has huge impacts on health as well as economic costs. There was a 2019 study which said that there were 10 climate sensitive events in US that cost $10 billion in health costs alone. And we have already seen how the weather is changing. We have less snow, and this is affecting agriculture in the state. The extreme weather events are taking place even here as well. So the economic impacts, the precipitation has been affected, and in Wisconsin is a big agriculture state, so as well as livestock. All of this is impacting the state, but we know that certain communities are also disproportionately affected, like African American people, low-income communities. They are impacted more by air pollution and flooding. And we saw that in relation to the coronavirus pandemic as well. I don't know whether you can see this properly, but this is emissions in Wisconsin by sector. So 33% is electricity, 24% transportation, 15% agriculture. So pretty similar to the federal level emissions as well. So the biggest chunk is electricity generation, and then carbon dioxide is the biggest gas as well. So this is Mary Robinson, who was the former president of Ireland and the special representative of the UN Secretary General on climate change. And she said climate change is the biggest human rights issue of the 21st century. This was several years ago that she said this. So although the impact of climate change on human beings is quite obvious, it was not considered as a human rights issue until quite recently. Well, when I say recently, about 10 years ago. So in 2009, the UN Human Rights Council adopted a resolution on climate change and human rights and requested the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to prepare a report on the link. And the report recognized that almost all human rights could be affected by climate change, starting with right to life, actually, because people have died as a result of climate change. To health consequences, right to health, right to food, water, right to a livelihood, because some people lose their livelihoods, some people lose their homes, freedom of movement could be curtailed. So almost all rights could be affected by climate change. So although a right to a healthy environment was not recognized as a separate right until recently, states have already signed on to human rights treaties, including the United States, So they have to ensure that people's rights are protected from adverse consequences of climate change, because they already have these obligations to protect their people. So when you look at the link between climate change and human rights, you have to look at different situations. It's because it's a global problem, it's very hard to pinpoint the responsibility on a particular state because it's a cumulative impact that's causing the problem. But when we saw that chart earlier, we saw that US and China are responsible for almost 50% of all emissions. So certain states have contributed more to the problem than others. So with regard to historic emissions, it's a little hard to establish causation, but states have to take measures to reduce their emissions. And they have already made pledges, but we saw that these pledges are not enough. And then when it comes to severe weather events, states have to protect its people from these severe weather events. We have seen communities being evacuated when necessary. They have been provided with shelter. States have to help them to rebuild their lives, maybe relocate them if necessary. And adaptation, I mentioned that the next 30 years we'll see the worsening impacts of climate change. So states have to help their people to adapt to the consequences of climate change, provide them with the necessary information, come up with adaptation plans. Some communities may have to be relocated from coastal areas, for example. So it's very important to incorporate traditional knowledge into these adaptation plans and formulate them with the involvement of the communities concerned. So, as I mentioned, those who contributed least to the problem are being affected most by the consequences. So the adaptation measures we put in place to address climate change should be evaluated for their human rights impact. So as I said, this adaptation plan should be made with the participation of those who are affected, provide them with the necessary information and get their input, consult with them. Those are important when it comes to adaptation and human rights. So this shows the contribution of greenhouse gases in relation to consumption. So this shows that the richest 10% is responsible worldwide, is responsible for almost half of total lifestyle consumption emissions. So richest 10% responsible for half of greenhouse gases, while the poorest 50% of the total population is responsible for only 10% of consumption emissions. So you can see the contribution of the rich to the climate change problem. And this shows the inverse. This shows the vulnerability to climate change. So the dark red and the red really shows who are vulnerable to climate change. And you can see that these are the poor countries that are more vulnerable to climate change. So those who are contributing more to climate change are not those who are actually vulnerable to climate change. So who are these vulnerable groups and states? So due to historic marginalization and other vulnerabilities, of course, geography plays a big role here as well. Some groups and states are more susceptible to climate change than others. These groups include women, children, indigenous peoples, the elderly, the poor, refugees, disabled people, minorities, and when it comes to countries, low-lying islands and small island states. So low-lying countries like Bangladesh, poor countries that lack the resources and the technology to engage in adaptation measures will be more vulnerable. And as we know, the environmental justice movement started in the US because of the practice of citing polluting activities in low-income and minority communities. And this practice is happening even now. Even though President Clinton issued an executive order, I think in 1981, on environmental justice and calling upon all federal agencies to take environmental justice concerns into account when approving new projects. So we can see that even in a rich country like ours, these different communities are affected more than others by these polluting activities. And climate change is no exception. So we really need to adopt a human rights and a justice framework to address climate change, because a one-size-fits-all approach will not help everybody. And we saw the very first sentence of the Universal Declaration was all human beings are equal in dignity and rights. And we won't be able to achieve that or apply that if we adopt a one-size-fits-all approach. So the environmental justice challenge is that there is an imbalance between those who benefit from economic activity that gives rise to these environmental problems, and those who bear its adverse environmental and social impacts. So this is the hallmark of environmental injustice. So in many societies, women are responsible for fetching water, gathering firewood. So climate change is going to exacerbate the situation of women, because they have to walk longer distances to collect water. This is like in miles, they have to walk miles to fetch water daily for consumption and their everyday use. So as a result, they might get subjected to sexual harassment. They have less time for education and leisure activities. So this is, there's a disproportionate impact on women. And I mentioned climate refugees. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change mentioned in 1990 that the greatest single impact of climate change could be on human migration. Unfortunately, the Geneva Convention on Refugees applies only to political refugees. So those who are, it covers only those who are fleeing persecution. Climate displacement will be mainly internal, so within countries, but there could be cross-border migration associated with climate change. But the Refugee Convention does not apply to them because they are not fleeing persecution. But some of the refugees that are crossing into the US from Central America are actually climate refugees, because they are leaving because of the drought and crop failures in their countries. So they are not really covered by the Refugee Convention. So there's a gap in international law when it comes to climate refugees, or those who are forced to flee as a result of climate change. So currently there's no political legal protection for this group of people. So at the Paris Agreement, Paris Conference, a task force on climate-related displacement was established to look into this issue, but it took the international community so many years, since 1990, to even acknowledge this issue. But although most displacement will take place within countries, even internal displacement can give rise to a lot of disruption and hardship for people. Imagine those who have to rebuild their lives after these severe weather events, when you lose everything you have, not to mention the lives lost. We really need to pay attention to displacement associated with climate change, whether it's across borders or within countries. And we know that after Hurricane Katrina, a lot of the people left the area and they migrated to other parts of the US and did not go back to their homes. And then there is a group of people who are unable to move, even if they want to. These are called trapped populations. This could be due to poverty, ill health, disability, etc., or even social norms in some countries. So we need to pay attention to these trapped populations as well. So I mentioned that there are communities in the US that are being forced to relocate. So this is one of the villages called Kivalina in Alaska. And scientists have estimated that this village will be underwater in 2025, which is not very far away. And this group in Louisiana is being relocated right now to the mainland. And Shishmarov, again in Alaska, is waiting to be relocated. So they haven't found land to relocate to. And just last week, I believe, President Biden allocated some funds. President Obama did too under his administration, but it was not enough. So these communities were not relocated last week. Some more funds were allocated to relocate the communities that are awaiting relocation because of climate change. Indigenous peoples, I already mentioned, many of these communities are indigenous that are awaiting relocation, and they are being disproportionately affected. And small island states, I will show where they are. They are in the Caribbean. There are some in the Indian Ocean and some in the Pacific. And there are close to 40 small island states. You would have heard of the Maldives, Tuvalu, Vanuatu. These islands are barely above sea level, and with sea level rise and these severe weather events, many of these islands are going to disappear. So the question is, what's going to happen to these people? Where are they going to go? Some have already started moving, migrating, but as I said, they're not entitled to refugee status under international law. And the other issue, of course, is we have a situation where almost 40 sovereign nations might disappear or might become uninhabitable. So what happens to them as sovereign nations? What will happen to these nations? Will they simply disappear? I think I will skip that. So this is one such Pacific island. They are already being flooded, and it's becoming impossible for some of them to live there. And this was during the COP conference last month. Say we are not drowning, we are fighting. So looking at justice as a framework, So that this disproportionate impact that will be borne by those who contributed least to the problem, like the small island states, their contribution to climate change is like 0.001%. So this inequality is a big challenge when it comes to addressing climate change. So there are lots of definitions of environmental justice, but it's considered to have at least 4 components. So distributive justice requires the fair allocation of both benefits and burdens. Procedural justice requires open, informed, and inclusive decision-making processes. I mentioned with regard to adaptation measures, we need to get these communities involved in drafting and formulating these plans. So getting their input is very important. And corrective justice is the third component. So this is the obligation to provide compensation and correct past wrongs, as well as holding those who contributed to the wrong accountable. So this is where we have a real problem, because we know that the fossil fuel companies are still profiting from contributing to the problem. We are not holding any of them accountable. So how do we do that? And social justice component highlights that many of these environmental struggles are intertwined with struggles for economic and social justice. So we need to look at these issues holistically, like, why are racial minorities more prone to these environmental problems? Why are they disproportionately impacted? So we need to look at the underlying reasons for this disproportionate impact. So this is this definition is from Mary Robinson Foundation. She has a foundation called on environmental justice, climate justice. She says that climate justice links human rights and development to achieve a human-centered approach, safeguarding the rights of most vulnerable, including women. She really highlights the need to apply a human rights approach to climate change. And for the first time, human rights was included in climate documents. The Paris Agreement was the first time that human rights was mentioned in a binding climate document. I mentioned that one of the issues with regard to climate change is holding those who contributed to the problem accountable, and look at the impacts on those who contributed least to the problem, and try and address those impacts, some of which are irreversible, like losing your culture, losing your whole country. How do you replace that? So the loss and damage mechanism was an approach that was included in the Paris Agreement, which also looks at climate displacement. So loss is considered as damage that's not repairable, so irreversible damage, and damage is considered reparable damage, which includes both economic damage and non-economic damage. So although this was included in the Paris Agreement in 2015, nothing was done until this year at COP27. So many of the small island states, actually led by Pakistan, which I mentioned had severe flooding this year, led the campaign to get to operationalize the loss and damage mechanism. So this is a photo from there, pay up for loss and damage. So finally, because of the lobby by developing countries, led by Pakistan, developed countries agreed to establish a fund, a separate fund, based on voluntary contributions, to address loss and damage associated with climate change. But of course, the modalities have to be worked out. It's not clear who should pay into it, how much, what will be covered, and who is eligible, and how funds will be distributed. So the institutions and legal mechanisms have to be worked out, but this was a huge victory for small island states who had been asking for this mechanism for many, many years. In fact, since the negotiations started. Finally, it's taking some shape, although many details have to be worked out. So as I said, we are not sure who should pay into this. Remember, I mentioned that China is the biggest contributor to climate change right now, but historically, US is responsible for 1/4 of all greenhouse gas emissions since the Industrial Revolution. So after COP27 conference, Gordon Brown, former UK Prime Minister, said contribution should be to the loss and damage fund should be based on the capacity to pay and historic liability for greenhouse gas emissions. And he wanted China to contribute to the fund as well. But China has historically not been required to pay into any of these funds, but here it has benefited from some of the funds. So I mentioned that the Human Rights Council recognized a right to a healthy environment as a human right in October 2021, and acknowledged that right to a healthy and sustainable environment is critical to the enjoyment of all human rights. It recognized that environmental degradation, climate change, and unsustainable development constitute serious threats for present and future generations to enjoy their rights. And also created the mandate for a special report on human rights and climate change. And the UN General Assembly adopted a similar resolution in July of this year. So as I mentioned, it took the international community 74 years to recognize this right since the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So to conclude, it is clear that we should not let these vulnerable states and communities to bear their losses alone. So some of the sort of thorny questions is that who is responsible to contribute to the fund? What is the responsibility of the major emitters, including the corporations, with regard to these communities? How do we ensure adequate financial flows to these countries? There's a big finance gap in addition to the emissions gap. Liability is a big issue and is problematic at the international level. So can we just, apportion funds, the contributions according to their greenhouse gas emission levels, or levy a percentage on profits with regard to these companies? So we saw that climate change is a very complex problem, and virtually everything we do contributes to it. So because it's such a big issue, a complex issue, it could seem overwhelming sometimes. It's a global collective action problem. Every state in the community, every sector of the economy, and every person is contributing. But we saw that some countries contribute more than others, and some communities bear the losses more than others. So we are fast approaching tipping points. So the window of opportunity we have to address climate change is getting smaller and smaller. Climate change affects the enjoyment of almost all human rights that are protected. And we need to act as if this is an emergency. We created this problem, we meaning human beings. We should try to solve it. I think we owe it to our children and grandchildren to do so. So declare a climate emergency, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Atapattu. I'm so sorry. I guess the inequity and just the amount of damage or potential damage from climate change is, based on what you said and what we've learned, is huge. The assuming responsibility and looking at where most of the climate change is occurring, I think would be interesting, because it's from your work that you showed, it was China and the United States had the largest amount of contributions to contributing to climate change.
Mm-hmm.
So it'd be interesting to look at how the response and accountability would occur or be distributed.
Yeah, I mean, especially China, because US has been contributing to these funds for quite some time, as well as European and other Western countries, industrialized countries. But China will be interesting to see whether they will contribute.
Yes, I would agree. I think that's really interesting. Are there questions or comments based on the presentation?
Mary, there's one in the chat.
Aaron, can you help with that?
Yeah.
Here, I'll see if I can open that up.
It says,
So
how,
it says, how encouraging is it to know we are finally finding out how to create nuclear fission, or is that too far down the road?
Well, I did read that it is, I mean, we won't be able to benefit from it yet. It'll be decades before, but who knows? I mean, we have developed in certain areas so quickly that we may be able to, but I'm not a fan of nuclear energy myself, because I feel that there are too many dangers involved. So I would exercise caution, but I know a lot of people are advocating for nuclear energy to address climate change. And I'm not a nuclear energy expert, so I will leave it there. Somebody else has a question?
Judy Miner up there.
Judy.
Hi, I loved your slides. Thank you so much. We do have someone on the call that was in Egypt at the COP27. Steve Watrous is visiting. I see he's on the call here from Milwaukee.
Oh,
So
wow.
he may have something. But my concern is always that the military emissions are left out of these statistics. And I don't know if this is true, if you know this, or if this is something I just heard. But at one of the earlier conferences, in order for the US to participate, everyone had to have an agreement to just leave military emissions out of the picture. And so that we would continue with this kind of forums. And it just seems to me like there's so much that's emitted through the US military that I wonder how that would change the pie charts if we did include the military stuff in there, because I know how many planes are flying and bases we're maintaining, and I don't know if that would change those charts a lot, and if there's any ever any discussion about putting military back into the formulas. Thank you. It was great.
Thank you for that question. I am not entirely sure that the military is not included. Maybe at the beginning, but I know the Pentagon, for example, has a huge report on climate change and the security implications. So